It is great to be back in Nantucket, and especially to welcome everyone to this ambitious and important symposium. I must say that if anyone had any doubts about the high aims of this program, the title, Nantucket's Golden Age, makes it pretty clear. But what I like best about this title is not that it looks back with yearning to another period. As you'll hear over the next few minutes, I'm actually skeptical about that as a justification for preservation, which to me should never be driven by a desire to escape into the past, something that very rarely comes to much good. Far better than looking at preservation as a way of going back into the past is the motivation, the desire to put great historic architecture to the service of making a better present, using it to make a present that is rich and complex and layered, to make a present that learns from the past and understands what led its builders to make the decisions they did within the context of the world they lived in. We want to leverage the past to make a better present. Louis Mumford, the great architectural critic and historian, once wrote that in a city, time becomes visible. And while Nantucket may not be a city in the conventional sense, it's absolutely and totally a place in which time becomes visible, and indeed, in which a perception of the layers of time and their constant visibility is essential to the experience of being here. We bring the past alive because it adds depth and resonance to the present, not because we want to escape down the rabbit hole of time into another world. But let me go back for a moment to this title and ponder for a bit what it means. Taken in the simplest way, of course, it could suggest the very kind of yearning for a past that I've just said I prefer to avoid. And it certainly seems to suggest that something was better then than it is now. Anytime you hear the phrase golden age applied to anything, it presumably implies that if that was the golden age, then the age we live in now must be something else, presumably something less glorious, definitely not golden. Well, perhaps. Although by some standards, since now this island seems more awash in money than it was in the days presumably represented in the Golden Age, I'm not sure this really is a lesser time. I suppose that if the late 18th and early 19th centuries was the Golden Age, our time could be called the Platinum Age or the Titanium Age, or whatever it is that American Express calls its fancy cards that are steps above the golden ones. But of course, whoever chose the title of this symposium was not thinking about money. The point was about architecture and urbanism, and about how brilliantly Nantucketers built at a certain time in their past. After all, during this time, the island as a whole may have been wealthy in the Golden Age, but an important fact of this time is that only a handful of the people who lived here really were tremendously wealthy. Most were not. There was plenty of income inequality, to use a phrase of our age. Only a few Nantucketers were whaling captains. Most were farmers or craftsmen or fishermen or shopkeepers. And while many were reasonably, even very prosperous, not all were. And even the prosperous were not all rolling in money. What really made the age golden to us as we look back to it as architectural historians is that it represented a golden time of building, of both house building and, even more important, of community building. Nantucket's golden riches were largely public. They were shared. Yes, the inner parlors of the Three Bricks were as private as the living rooms and media rooms of the wealthiest Nantucket residents today, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the public realm of the town and its streets, and the waterfront, and the gardens, and about how all of the private places came together to make a magnificent public place. The houses were all of a piece, each an element in the larger composition that made a streetscape, and each of the streets an element in the still larger composition that made a townscape. What we cherish in large part about the Nantucket of today is a gift to us from the builders of the island's golden age. And we preserve it because it is beautiful, because it still works so brilliantly, because it gives us pleasure, and because it contains within it lessons about how you make a community out of individual pieces of architecture. You can choose any of these reasons, or take all of them. For me, the last one is the most important of all, because the buildings of Nantucket's golden age are in every way a metaphor for community. They have a public face, and they treat each other with respect. They allow for some degree of difference, recognizing that if everything is exactly the same, a place is as boring and dull as it would be if every person were the same. And they have private sides that, quite properly, are more distinct, more individual than their public faces. The great lesson the town of Nantucket offers us is the lesson of how the most civilized towns and villages make manifest in physical form all of our best ideas of community and of civilization, and of how we need to treat each other to get along. Respect for differences, but everyone agreeing to certain common ideas, the most important of which, of course, is the idea of the street itself, the public place that binds all of it together. The street is a room by agreement, the great architect Louis Kahn once said, and of course that's exactly right. It is a room by agreement of all of the people who build upon it and who together make a place that is larger and more meaningful than any of them could have achieved alone. And that, of course, is the ultimate lesson of all towns, that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. If you had to explain the meaning of urbanism to somebody in a single sentence, it would come down to that. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. The shingled houses of Nantucket are beautiful, each and every one of them, as a thing unto itself. But when you put them together to make the streets, to make the extraordinary townscape that they create, it becomes something magnificent and meaningful, far beyond anything that any one of these houses can achieve as a single object unto itself. Preserving Nantucket's magnificent townscape is, to me, the most urgent of all missions here. It's been clear for a long time that there's a deep and widely felt love for this place that motivates all of the preservation efforts here. And since a sense of emotional connection underlies almost all preservation, and indeed almost all meaningful community making, it's impossible not to admire this love and think of it as primarily a positive force. Love for Nantucket, after all, has brought forth one of the most important developments in the island's history, without which I believe it truly would have been destroyed in the middle of the 20th century, which is the land preservation effort funded by a real estate transfer tax, an innovation in which Nantucket was a national pioneer. I lived part of the time in East Hampton, in Long Island, and I remember looking with envy at this bold step, which we on Long Island imitated, but far too late, after much of the damage had been done. I mean no disrespect to anything the Preservation Foundation has done to say that the single most important thing that has happened in Nantucket in modern times is that land preservation tax, since without preserving the land and the open space and the restrictions on development that have come along with it, not too much else would matter. Well, not literally so. The great individual landmarks of Nantucket, like the one we're in right now, would surely have been saved, but they would have been within a very different place, a place that would have been compromised by suburban sprawl, and they would have less meaning as a result. Here, as in very few places in the United States, the distinction between town and village and countryside remains. It is not all turned into a suburban blur. Yes, if you've been here for 50 years, you see how much additional building there's been and things feel somewhat different. But they are really more the same than they are different. And the land transfer tax is a key reason that's so. It's the key reason that the fundamental essence of this place has been preserved, which in turn allows the Nantucket Preservation Foundation to do its essential work of preserving individual buildings and the all-important townscape. I think the same profound love for Nantucket that led to the innovation of the transfer tax has also motivated the ongoing protection of the town of Nantucket and the village of Sconset, two of the most precious examples of American urbanism that exist anywhere. I'll say one more time that there really is nothing like the town of Nantucket. Its physical form is beautiful and nearly perfect, and there are times when I really feel as if I could walk on these streets forever. The urban idea that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and that the town's public space and its streets and the facades of its buildings are all a form of common ground. Now, this is what we want a community to mean. To lose this would have been devastating. Now, of course, it's all well and good to talk about the value of streetscape and townscape and about the glories of the whole of Nantucket. But you cannot preserve a whole without preserving the parts. So we come back, inevitably, to individual buildings, even if the larger ensemble is the primary mission. And here, of course, I'm talking again about the town more than the many smaller clusters of houses and little communities elsewhere on the island. I suspect that most of you in this room will have no disagreement with any of this and share my view that the town of Nantucket, as an ensemble, is one of the great achievements of American urbanism, and that its preservation is one of the most important achievements of the American preservation movement and must continue to be a priority. Let me now switch gears a bit and talk about another aspect of our subject, one that I suspect some of you might not entirely agree with me on, and that is the whole question of just how we should treat each of these individual buildings that make up this incomparable townscape. I don't believe that we are obligated to show our respect for historic buildings, the historic buildings that we've inherited, by making each and every one of them look as close as possible to the way they might have looked 150 years ago. And I am not a believer in the sanctity of every single board, every single molding, every door, and every window. Another way to put this might be to say that I wonder sometimes if it is possible to love something too much. No, I don't really mean to say it that way, since I don't really think it's possible to love great architecture too much. So maybe a better way to say it would be to say, I wonder if it's possible to sometimes express your love in too intense a way. Like a parent who smothers a child in love and who, under the misapprehension that he or she is doing it for the child's good, will hold it so tightly that it can barely breathe and can't make a move on its own. Can't raise children that way, of course, and I'm not entirely sure that you can always nurture a community either if you want it to be a real place and not a false and static one. Now, if you choose to preserve your own house that way, to seek a kind of archaeological preservation, restoring everything as close as possible to its original design, bless you and more power to you. But I don't believe that that is the only way to show respect for the past, or that we need ordain it for all houses in all circumstances. I think that generally our great older houses and great public buildings are stronger than we give them credit for being, and often they can handle some interventions from the 21st century. Certainly in their interiors, sometimes even on the more private sides of their exteriors that do not face the street. Now, please know that by saying this, I am not dismissing the arguments against wholesale and radical change. I've always loved that Nantucket line, gut fish, not houses. But I'm saying that we should not consider some limited degree of opening up of an interior to make a house more workable for 21st century living to automatically be a form of unconscionable desecration. More to the point, I think it's important, even urgent, for the 20th century to show that it can intervene. I actually like that word, intervene. I'm not sure it's always a bad thing. I believe the 20th century can intervene in a great older house in a way that is both assertive and respectful. We do not need to see preservation solely as a vote of no confidence in our own age, as a statement that we prefer the judgment of another age, no matter how much we cherish the great buildings that that age has bequeathed to us. I worry, to be perfectly honest, that the preservation movement can sometimes fall prey to what I call preservation fundamentalism. Like religious fundamentalism, it deals in absolutes and admits to no exceptions. Preservation fundamentalists believe that there is only one way to treat a building properly, just as religious fundamentalists believe that there is only one way to worship God, and that everyone who sees it differently is an infidel. Well, I am no infidel in preservation. I deeply believe in it, and I hope after many years as a trustee of the National Trust and now as an emeritus trustee and an active member of many other preservation organizations that my credentials as a preservationist should not be suspect. But I'm also no fundamentalist. Now, in some ways, it's hard to blame preservation fundamentalists. It's tempting to want to have rules and formulas to guide us and to protect us from the worst scourges of modern architecture, just as religious fundamentalists think that rigid doctrines will protect them from sin. But the opposite of rigid doctrine isn't sin, it's enlightenment and reasoned discourse. It's the rational world in which we solve problems one by one, depending on the nature of the particular circumstances that they represent, in which we are guided by values and principles, not by narrow doctrine. Now, I don't want to carry this analogy too far, since I wish neither to be disrespectful to faith or to preservation. My point is to say that modern architecture is not a sin that preservation will protect us from, any more than modern life is an evil that religious fundamentalism will protect us from. Yes, modernism has brought us some pretty awful buildings here and everywhere else, just as modern life has been full of some pretty terrible human behavior. But fundamentalist doctrine will not protect us from either one of those things. Reasoned, enlightened thinking has a much better chance. The world changes and evolves. It always has, and it always will. Without that, we're living in a place of delusion, a place of make-believe. That does not mean that we give in to all impulses and say that anything goes, quite the contrary. It means that we let ourselves be guided by values and principles, and by reason and judgment in how we apply them. One of the best statements of this idea was a wonderful observation by the British writer G.K. Chesterton, who was himself actually quite conservative, as well as a deeply religious Catholic. And he worked hard to reconcile his preference for traditional things with his recognition that the world continues to move forward. All conservatism, Chesterton wrote, is based upon the idea that if you leave things alone, you leave them as they are. But you do not. If you leave a thing alone, you leave it to a torrent of change. If you leave a white post alone, it will soon be a black post. If you particularly want it to be white, you must be painting your fence again. That is, you must always be having a revolution. Briefly, if you want the old white fence post, you must have a new white fence post. You must always be having a revolution. Think about that for a moment. You must always be having a revolution, not to make things different, but to keep them the same. You must intervene, to repeat a word I used a few moments ago. If Nantucket had been truly left alone, it would have been a decrepit mess in the 20th century. And then, as it entered what I referred to as today's platinum age, it would have been a bazaar of excess, its great architecture this time not destroyed by neglect, but by indifferent replacement by other things that in all probability would have been of greater size and of lesser value. Of course, Nantucket was not left alone. The first generation of preservationists intervened to rehabilitate the buildings of old Nantucket that prior generations had failed to understand or value. And then their followers instituted the land transfer tax we were talking about, a massive intervention of a different sort. And now we do all kinds of other things to continue to intervene. We know that to leave this island alone is not the way to keep the Nantucket that we love. To leave it alone was once a way of seeing its great architecture deteriorate. And then in more recent years, had we continued to leave it alone, it would have meant a tsunami of overdevelopment, destroying much of the island's architectural heritage in its path. How lucky we all are that our predecessors understood what G.K. Chesterton was saying and were willing to intervene boldly to keep things the same. Poverty is often a great friend to preservation, since whatever else it brings, it rarely causes the demolition of historic buildings that is so often the result of great prosperity. Poverty buys time, and the poverty that Nantucket experienced for a long time at least prevented the wholesale destruction of its architectural heritage. Until the time came when we as a culture were beginning to understand and appreciate the benefits of preserving our great buildings and townscapes. Until the time when we were ready to intervene, if I may use that word again, to halt the deterioration and begin to rescue this island, commencing the effort of restoring its great treasures that led to the Nantucket Preservation Foundation and brings us, in a sense, to where we are today. Now, I said just a moment ago that if we had not continued to intervene in Nantucket's development in the middle of the 20th century, after the island's slow decline had been halted and people had begun to restore the architecture of its golden age as prosperity returned to the island, reinvented as a resort colony, this new prosperity could well have created a situation in which economic pressures would have replaced many of the island's great older buildings with things that were almost surely would have been of lesser value and of greater size. If the island had not been poor in the first half of the 20th century, it would not have been as attractive as it is in the second half of the 20th century, because it probably would have been ruined by overdevelopment. Of course, we've seen at least some of that anyway, in spite of all efforts and all interventions. We all know that the new houses that get built here are almost without exception larger than the old ones. And if it were not for land preservation and for all the various codes that keep the town intact, we would have suburban sprawl filling the entire island. Nantucket's relative freedom from the plague of McMansions that afflicts most prosperous communities is a sign that you have done most things right here, and that the codes, tight and demanding though they are doing necessary work and providing a necessary degree of protection. Codes and regulations are a form of intervention, and a vital one. Yet they need always to be in balance, and we need to keep in mind the risks of a kind of architectural fundamentalism as dangerous as preservation fundamentalism. I'm more comfortable with planning codes that restrict land use and guarantee open space and keep the urban fabric strong and limit building size than I am in favor of style-based design codes, particularly when you get away from the historic core. Let me say a word now about the question of architectural regulation so far as new structures are concerned, an area in which I think the preservation mentality has sometimes been corrupted or at least confused and turned into an instrument of making brand new things look automatically like old ones. Well, imitation may be the sincerest form of flattery in architecture as it is in life, but as you don't build a deep relationship on flattery, you don't build lasting communities on it either. For all my love of this island and for all my deep admiration for the extraordinary conservation work that has been done here, I've never been totally convinced that Nantucket's strict architectural regulations outside of the limits of the town of Nantucket and the village of Sconset were the right way to go. They mean well, definitely. I'm not sure we can blame the creators of the island's review system for believing that keeping things to a single style was the safest and best way to safeguard the island's heritage. After all, in the 1960s and 70s, as the preservation movement was building, modern architecture was not offering particularly sympathetic options. Indeed, sympathy for older architecture and belief in the power of architectural context was something many modernists disdained. Modernism then took the arrogant view that new times demanded architecture utterly new, utterly different, and utterly indifferent to anything around it. No wonder people ran as fast as they could into what they thought was the safe embrace of old 19th century shingled architecture. Mandating that every building have shingles and look more or less like 19th century Nantucket architecture seemed like the only way to prevent all of this awful modern stuff from polluting the island. Here, as in so many places, people often made their architectural decisions less out of love of the old than out of fear of the new. That, fear of the new, has always been the secret, dark underside of preservation. The secret reason we have done a lot of the historic preservation that we've done everywhere. And it's the least admirable and least honorable reason to preserve, and the wrong way to regulate the new. And it is the reason that Nantucket sometimes threatens to look like a shingled theme park, in the same way that Santa Fe can look like an adobe theme park and Santa Barbara a Spanish Mediterranean theme park. There seems to be a kind of safety in embracing an older style, and never mind the fact that as we produce more and more of it and get farther and farther away from the conditions that produced it originally, the whole thing begins to take on more than a bit of the air of kitsch. Like all kitsch, it is well-meaning, but there's something that's just a little too soft about it, too indulgent, too sentimental. I don't think you build a community solely on the sentimental. The 18th and early 19th century buildings of Nantucket that we all so love and that we're here to talk about this week were rigorous, tough things, built to please and to last, yes, but also built to practical purpose. They were a product of the technology, often the very latest technology of their time. They had emotion in them and the ability to inspire emotion and deep feeling in those who used them. But those things are very different from sentimentality and nostalgia. Memory and the ability to evoke the spirit of a place is, of course, a critical underpinning of preservation, but that is not the same as sentimentality. It is a subtle difference, but an essential one. There's a kind of shallowness to sentimentality that's very different from the deep and resonant feelings of memory. And so much of the new architecture that gets made today seems motivated more by the glib impulses of sentimentality, which I suspect might have offended the 19th century builders who we are imitating. They would probably have had no patience with such soft and self-indulgent feelings. They had much more practical things on their minds. But if things are different today, as I said, and the reality of our time is that the island is now an affluent tourist economy, not an older agricultural or seafaring economy, then what is wrong with a little bit of sentimentality? Doesn't it fit right in with this new identity? After all, isn't this place about leisure and entertainment now? Are we not here for softer, more indulgent reasons than the founders of Nantucket? And if the proper role of the island now is to provide a climate for relaxation rather than a climate for whaling or farming, then why not design in a way that is sentimental and easy? I don't actually have a simple answer to that, especially since I think I've already made it plenty clear that I think that the opposite of strict architectural regulation, letting everyone do whatever they pleased, would be a disaster and would, in the name of freedom, seriously damage the spirit of the place that we are all committed to preserving. But maybe what I'm really trying to say is that we risk damaging that spirit anyway by imitating older architecture over and over and over, since by doing that we are diluting the strength of the original to the point where it may no longer have the value and the meaning it once did. I do think we have already diluted Nantucket's 18th century architecture by blurring the distinction between the authentic and the imitations. And there has to be a point in which the dilution becomes so strong that the original is robbed of its strength and its impact. Architectural regulations are a safety net. They prevent certain kinds of disasters. They assure that nobody will put a huge pyramid of gold-colored mirrored glass with a rotating neon sign on top of a roof on Hulbert Avenue. And we should all be very grateful for that. But at the same time that they save us from such horrors, they run the risk of squeezing out fresh air and making it hard for creative architects to produce new designs that try to interpret the spirit of Nantucket in a way that is genuinely reflective of the island's new identity. A safety net is also a ceiling, and that is damaging to the ongoing life of any place because it forces it toward the false, toward the make-believe, toward the disingenuousness of the theme park. We need to find a way to be open to more creative new architecture that nevertheless respects the spirit of this place. I'm not sure in the end that we don't pay a high price for the safety net that architectural regulation gives us. It's a kind of planning and design version of the nanny state, a well-intentioned attempt to safeguard us, but sometimes intrusive to the point where you wonder where the line should be drawn. Again, I offer the analogy of whether it's possible to love something too much and to smother it. So I'm against architectural fundamentalism as much as I'm against preservation fundamentalism. Let me tell you quickly, before we conclude, about one recent situation I was involved in, quite a distance from here in Washington, D.C., another place in which historic fabric properly weighs heavily on all planning and architectural decisions and has sometimes had the effect of squeezing out fresh air. This story involves a large, unusual, and not entirely unappealing industrial building at the edge of Georgetown, a heating plant built by the federal government in 1946 to provide heat for numerous government buildings. It's a huge box, as high as one of the Capitol's office buildings, lined with vertical strip windows and given some attractive art moderne detailing to give it the appearance of a conventional building, which it most definitely is not. It is really a shell designed to cover boilers, which are no longer there because the building no longer operates. There's now a plan to convert it into luxury condominiums that would be affiliated with the Four Seasons Hotel next door. The new building's been designed by David Adjaye, an internationally acclaimed architect of considerable talent. Turns out that the building is not structurally sound, and much of it has been so damaged by years of neglect since it ceased operating as a power plant nearly 20 years ago, that much of it needs to be reconstructed completely. David Adjaye came up with a beautiful plan that was rejected by community preservationists in Georgetown, who objected to the fact that even though it replicated the overall bulk and shape of the massive old power plant and made use of many of the same materials, it didn't look enough like the old building. So he redesigned the new condominium to look more like the old power plant. But to make the project work for its new use, he needed to add 2 more vertical lines of windows, since unlike boilers, condominium residents like having some view of the outdoors. There were still objections, and some preservationists argued that the architect had not worked hard enough to find a solution that would make it look as if nothing had happened to the original building, which they considered to be a vital landmark in the nation's capital. I happened to be at the hearing at the Commission of Fine Arts at which this building was discussed, and I was struck by the absurdity of it all. This shell, intended to cover boilers, empty and disused for nearly 20 years, was about to take on new life as a residential building, bringing additional economic benefit to the community. and no additional traffic as a public building might bring. But some members of the historic preservation community were objecting to the fact that the new residential building would not look enough like the old power plant, and tried to argue that the old building was a structure of transcendent importance. That is preservation fundamentalism and architectural fundamentalism bound together. Keep the building exactly as it was, or if you need to replace something because it's structurally unsound, put it back so it looks exactly as it was, and never mind the fact that it was once a power plant and now will be people's homes. Now, thankfully, there is nothing like this particular situation in Nantucket. No enormous, bulky industrial box that is being remade into condos and the center of a struggle between people who wanted to continue to look like an enormous, bulky box. In truth, the earlier design for that Washington building was much better when the architect had been a little freer to use his imagination, as well as to respond to the demands of his program. That's really the point I'm trying to make, and if there's no precise equivalent to this here, the lessons are definitely relevant. The world changes, and society changes, and the needs of people change. Yes, we all believe in the value of authenticity, but what exactly does authenticity mean in the 21st century? If we all were really serious about authenticity in Nantucket, then I guess we should all be whaling captains or sailors or farmers or shopkeepers. We should not be tourists or travelers or office workers who come here in search of beauty and respite from the pressures of our daily lives, which is what Nantucket exists primarily to provide. So in truth, authenticity in Nantucket in the 21st century means to be a resort and a community of primarily second homes, just as the authenticity of the power plant in Georgetown now means being a part of the world of Four Seasons condominiums. Now, I do not mean by that to say that we must accept the world as it is and embrace all of its excesses and foolishness and silliness and greed. The preservation movement has been pushing back against those things for several generations now, with mostly great success, and it has changed the world. Nantucket is one of its greatest successes, and I think I've made clear by now how great I feel the achievement of preservation here has been. The last thing in the world I'm arguing for is laissez-faire, just letting things happen. But as we go forward, let us remember that it is not rules and formulas that make great architecture. It is proportion and scale and light and materials and beauty of composition, and that these things can be done in 100 million ways, ways that no bureaucratic regulator can think of. We want the architectural imagination to have a chance to flourish, and we want to be able to show that making architecture that both pleases the emotions and shapes a civilized community is not something that only the past knew how to do. We can do it too in the 21st century, and we do it in part by being surrounded by the best of the 18th and 19th centuries and being inspired by the great work of those eras that we have preserved, in part, I should add, to provide this very kind of inspiration. If we preserve to make a better present, having the architecture of the past be an inspiration is a big part of making a better present. And inspiration does not mean imitation. To learn from the great architecture of Nantucket's golden age does not mean we must make all our new buildings look like them. It does not mean that you cannot ever do so. I have no more patience with modernists who reject that, as I do with any other kind of fundamentalist. But I would never want to be limited by that kind of approach to architecture. It is right for some circumstances, for some people, and for some physical places. And there's plenty of contemporary architecture in Nantucket that looks like old architecture, and a great deal of it is perfectly fine. But if that is all we have, then we do have a theme park, not a living community. And the best way to honor the old architecture we love is to absorb the ideas that underlie it and extend them into the present time. It is by doing that, by getting into the spirit of older buildings rather than copying their surface, that we truly give historic architecture the ongoing life that we want it to have. Of course, we're gathered here today and over the next couple of days, not to talk about how best to design new buildings, but how best to preserve older ones. But these things are not disconnected. We do not preserve in a vacuum. One of the things I've been saying is that we preserve in the context of place, since all buildings, new and old, get their meaning from place. The architecture makes the place, and the place makes the architecture. It is a mutually necessary and mutually reinforcing relationship. And the nature of any place is shaped by what we build now, as much as by what we have built before. An 18th century house in Nantucket has a different meaning if it is in a place that has not a single contemporary building. That kind of place, as I said a moment ago, is a theme park, not a real place. The Nantucket of the Golden Age was built to be real, not to be a place of make-believe, and I hope we can continue to preserve in the context of the real. There's a lot that we in Nantucket's Platinum Age can learn from the island's Golden Age. The lessons are about buildings working together to make community, about the balance of public and private, about the value of the public realm, about the magnificence of craftsmanship, and about the way in which human imagination, through architecture, can both solve practical problems and bring true joy and deep serenity. If we can manage to do these things even half as well in our time as our predecessors did in the Golden Age, we will have achieved something to be very proud of. Thank you.